Johnny Unitas wasn't supposed to make it. Too skinny, too dumb, too weak. They said he wasn't built for pro football. Cut by the Steelers before he ever played a snap, his NFL dreams seemed over before they started. From working construction and playing semi-professional football for $6 a game to becoming the face of the NFL, Unitas rewrote what it meant to be a quarterback. By the time he retired, he wasn't just a player. He was a legend, with MVPs, championships, and records that stood for decades. This is the story of how a kid nobody wanted became the NFL's greatest quarterback. Unitas was tough as nails, and that had been developed from a young age because he lost his father at the age of 5. In high school, it wasn't uncommon to see him jumping in the air while heaving a pass 40 yards. At just under 6 foot at that time, he could barely see over the lineman. Unitas' high school resume was enough for him to get interest from various colleges, but setbacks would be part of Unitas' path to Canton. His dream was to play for Notre Dame, but he failed to secure a spot on the roster because they thought he was too skinny. He weighed about 140 pounds at the time. Not to worry, because the University of Pittsburgh would offer him a scholarship. The only thing is, he'd lose that offer quickly because he failed the entrance exam. He would manage to land a spot at the University of Louisville, but this was before the days they were a competitive team. He turned up to college weighing about 145 pounds, despite measuring in at 6'1", but in his first 2 years he'd bulk up and gained about 40 pounds. He'd get his first start in Louisville's 5th game of the season in his freshman year. Down 19-0 at half, he was subbed in and Unitas played as if he'd been the starter the whole time. With 11 straight passes and 3 touchdowns, he engineered an inspiring comeback in his first game, although they just came up short, losing 21-19. However, now there was hope. And what everyone would come to realize, there was always hope when you had Unitas. They started 1-4 that season, but thanks to Unitas they'd win their next 4 games and finish with a 5-4 record. However, 1952 would destroy the hope they'd been building that previous season. Losing 5 of their last 6 games, they'd finished 3-8. But Unitas was still on top form, finishing the season with a 50% completion percentage and 12 touchdowns. Remember, this is the 50s, so those stats are pretty good for the era. Louisville made budget cuts, so 15 players lost their scholarship, leaving the roster depleted. They were left with so few players that Unitas had to play defense and even some time as a kick returner. During this time, Unitas received an offer from the University of Indiana, but he was loyal. Louisville gave him a shot when nobody else wanted him, so he was staying there. His loyalty wasn't rewarded in terms of winning, with the Cardinals going 1-7 in 1953 and 3-6 in 1954. But Unitas would still have a successful college career, finishing with over 2,900 yards and 27 touchdowns. He'd be drafted by his hometown team, the Steelers, in the 9th round. However, with Unitas, they now had 4 quarterbacks on the roster. This meant he was getting no opportunities, not even in training camp. Saying that, the Steelers head coach Walt Kiesling actually believed Unitas was too dumb to run the offense, but he wasn't getting any reps, so I'm not sure how he came to that conclusion. And ultimately, he'd be cut before the season even began. Enter the Cleveland Browns. Well, for a brief moment anyway. Otto Graham had just retired, so Unitas reached out to Brown asking for a tryout. Brown, however, had managed to persuade Graham to come out of retirement for one final season, so Unitas was told he could come back the following season to try out if he wanted to. With a little bit of hope, Unitas would commit to the Rams for the time being. No, wrong team. The Bloomfield Rams, a semi-professional football team. Scraping by on $6 per game while also working construction, he wasn't giving up on his dream for the NFL. And good job he didn't, because things were about to turn around for the construction worker moonlighting as a semi-pro QB. As is often the case with the underdog story, once they get their opportunity, they do not waste it. In Weeb Eubank's own words, the most important thing of all about Unitas is that he had a real hunger. This was a kid who wanted success and didn't have it so long that he wasn't about to waste it when it came. The Colts found out about joining Unitas and offered him a tryout. George Shaw, the team's bonus pick, had a strong rookie season, but with the retirement of their backup quarterback, a spot opened up, and Unitas secured it, earning $7,000 in the process, a decent bump from $6 a game. But again, no smooth sailing in this man's story. His first game was bad. His first pass ended in a pick 6, but it got worse. He fumbled the handoff on the next play and it was recovered by the Bears. It's not about failing though, it's about how you respond. After George Shaw got injured, Unitas stepped in and, well, never stepped out again. Unitas quickly rebounded from that loss, leading the Colts to an upset victory over the Green Bay Packers. He threw 9 touchdowns that season, including one in the season finale that started his record of 47 consecutive games with a touchdown, which stood for over 50 years. And his 55.6% completion mark was a rookie record. His first full season in 1957 was, well, I'll let the numbers do the talking. He led the NFL in all of these categories. The Colts finished 7-5, their first winning record in franchise history. Then, in just his second full year as a starter in 1958, Unitas broke 3 ribs and punctured his lung against the Packers. 4 weeks later, though, he was back, slinging it and leading the Colts to one of his many comebacks, a 27-7 deficit at the half against the 49ers, which ended in a 35-27 Colts victory. He'd finished that season leading the league in touchdowns and quarterback rating and led the Colts to the championship game against the Giants. Now, I just made a video about the greatest game ever played, which was this 1958 title game, so I'll keep this short. This game turned Unitas into a household name. He led the Colts to a 23-17 overtime victory, orchestrating a game-tying drive to send it to overtime, and then a game-winning drive in overtime. In typical Unitas fashion, he took matters into his own hands when he passed at the 6-yard line in overtime when a field goal would have won the game, and his coach had just instructed him to keep it on the ground. At a time when quarterbacks only called some of their own plays, Unitas called everything. "Don't send plays. I'm the quarterback and I'm calling the game, period," he once quipped. On this play in overtime, passing worked. He'd connect with Muchler, get to the 1, and then they'd run in for the win. The drives are even more impressive, given the rules at the time. No spiking, and throwing out of bounds was intentional grounding. In Hall of Fame Sam Huff's own words, "Every time I thought he was going to run, he threw it. And every time I thought he was going to throw it, he ran." He was always one step ahead. Unitas saw mismatches, he knew how to exploit them, but this wasn't some innate talent. Maybe partly, but he wasn't this gifted wonder kid. And I think it comes from his godlike work ethic. Running through countless plays with his trusted target Raymond Berry, working after practice, studying film with teammates, he was relentless. 1959 would be more of the same. He led the league in passing yards, touchdown passes, and completions. He won his first MVP and most importantly, led the Colts to a 31-16 victory over the Giants again in their second straight title game. The Colts would then struggle for a few years, although Unitas was still playing well. In 1963, for example, he led the league in passing yards. By 1964, they were back. Unitas was MVP again, and they were playing in the title game against the Browns. This time, however, they got toasted 27-0. 1965 looked like more of the same. He was an MVP favourite, and the Colts looked formidable, but a season-ending knee injury for Unitas ruined the season. Unitas would keep being Unitas though. He'd come back in 1967 and win his third MVP, throwing for over 3,400 yards and 20 touchdowns. In 1968, Unitas would injure his arm and only play 5 games. Father Time eventually calls for everybody, and after he injured his arm, he wouldn't be the same. 64 of his career interceptions came from 1968 onwards, when injuries had finally taken a toll. He would still play for a few more years though. In 1968, the Colts made it to Super Bowl III, and they subbed in Unitas late in the game to try and orchestrate one of his textbook comebacks. But the Jets would pull off the major upset, winning 16-7. They'd be back for Super Bowl V against the Cowboys, and Unitas would lead the charge, but he'd suffer a rib injury in the second quarter. The Colts won, but I'm sure it must have been hard for Unitas to watch from the sideline as his backup guided the Colts from a 13-6 deficit at halftime. In 1973, Unitas' best days were behind him, and he was traded to the Chargers. He didn't give them much time though, and he retired in 1974. Although that arm injury kind of ruined the final few years of his career, the legend of Unitas cannot be tarnished. The man who defied the odds and changed how the quarterback position was played.